So in the last lesson, we created our first React component, and inside the component, we returned a template that looks just like HTML. This is the template that React DOM injects into our HTML page when we use this render method down here. Now, the template is not actually HTML. It's something called JSX, which is almost identical to HTML, but with a few differences. Now, JSX stands for JavaScript XML and basically allows us to write this XML or HTML-like syntax inside a JavaScript file or script tag. Then, when this component is rendered to the DOM, that JSX is compiled into regular JavaScript by the Babel compiler we loaded in earlier, and that JavaScript injects this HTML-like structure into the DOM. This is the reason we needed to add Babel to our HTML file, because the browser doesn't understand JSX and it needed to be compiled for it to work. So, like I said, JSX is very similar to a regular HTML, but there are some slight differences. The main one, which you're going to run into most often, is the class attribute, to add CSS classes to elements. For example, I might want to give this div a class of banner so I can style it later on. Now, in JSX, we don't use class as an attribute because in JavaScript class is a reserved keyword. So instead we need to use the class name attribute whenever we want to add a class to an element in our component template. And then when our component is compiled and rendered, this is output as a regular class attribute in the browser. And now in the browser, if we inspect the element in Chrome's DevTools, you can see right there that the class name attribute is turned into a regular class attribute in the browser. So that's a pretty big difference, right? And sometimes, to be honest, I still forget to use class name instead of class when I'm writing JSX template. But React will warn you in the browser console when you make that mistake, so you can just come and rectify it. Okay, so the second difference is that when we work with JSX, it must have just a single root element. In our components so far, we only have a single root element, the div tag, so this is absolutely fine. But what I can't do now is add another root element next to it. If I do this, if I add another div underneath it, then we're going to see some kind of error squiggle. And if we hover over that error, we can see that it says JSX expressions must have one single parent element. So this right here, what we're doing, is not allowed. Now we can nest as many elements inside the one single parent element as we want side by side, that's fine, but we're only allowed one root parent element. So what I could do is move this div down here, I could cut it and move it inside the other div next to the paragraph tag, and that would be absolutely fine because now we only have one single root element. Now that's not the case in HTML, we can have several root elements in an HTML page, but in JSX we can only have one. So that's two major differences between JSX and HTML that you need to be aware of. Now, another quick difference I want to show you is how we do comments in JSX. So since we're essentially just writing JavaScript here, we can use the JavaScript style comments, which is // for a line comment. Now in HTML, it would be a combination of angle brackets, the exclamation mark, and some hyphens. Now there are some other differences between HTML and JSX as well, which we'll come to later in the course, but for now, there's one final difference I want to show you, and that's how to directly output JavaScript expressions and variables inside a JSX template, something we can't do easily in HTML, and we're going to take a look at that in the next lesson.